Welcome to the story. Don't forget to like, subscribe and support me. The winds howled over the scorched plains, carrying the scent of ash and charred earth, a reminder of the war that had only recently ended. The once vibrant fields that separated the lands of humans, elves, dwarves, and dragons now lay in ruin. But peace, fragile though it may be, had been achieved at a great cost. For the first time in history, the four great races had come together to forge an alliance, an alliance held together not by the force of arms, but by the power of politics. And so it was decided, leadership would no longer be won by the sword but by election. The announcement of the election had been met with mixed emotions. Among the elves, who had long prided themselves on their isolationist stance, there was great resistance. The dragon race, known for their fierce independence and ancient traditions, met the idea with similar disdain. Yet both races knew that without some form of governance, the uneasy peace would shatter, and war would once again claim the land. In the grand halls of the dragon capital, high above the jagged cliffs of Mount Cauldron, the ancient dragon king sat on his throne of blackened stone, his scales gleaming like molten gold in the fading light. His name was Britas, and for centuries, he had ruled over the dragons with an iron will. Though his body bore the marks of countless battles, his mind remained as sharp as ever. The weight of leadership had grown heavy over the years, and while his kin clamored for a strong hand to guide them in the coming election, Britas longed for peace. He had seen too much bloodshed in his lifetime, and though he was hesitant to embrace the idea of an election, he knew it was the only way to avoid plunging the world back into chaos. Across the sea, in the lush forests of Eleonora, Lysandra stood before the Council of Elders, her heart pounding in her chest. The young elf leader was an outlier, a reformist among a sea of traditionalists. Her dark hair cascaded over her shoulders as she faced the assembled elders, her voice steady despite the opposition she faced. "We can no longer cling to the ways of the past," Lysandra declared, her green eyes flashing with passion. "If we do not embrace change, if we do not reach out to early as a yes, even the dragons we will be left behind." Murmurs of discontent rippled through the room. The elves had suffered greatly during the war, their ancient forests burned by dragon fire, their cities reduced to rubble. Many of the older generation harbored a deep resentment toward the dragons, a sentiment Lysandra knew all too well. "Reaching out to the dragons? To those who nearly destroyed us?" One of the elders, a withered elf named Eldrin, spat in disbelief. "You would make a pact with our greatest enemies?" Lysandra stood firm. "The war is over. We cannot afford to see them as enemies any longer. The election is our opportunity to reshape the future, not only for the elves but for all races. We must take this chance." The council remained divided, but Lysandra had garnered enough support to be nominated as the elven candidate. She knew the road ahead would be perilous. The Dragon King was her opponent, and though she respected his wisdom, she also knew that his vision for the future was one rooted in the past. Where Britas sought to preserve the status quo, Lysandra sought reform, a radical reform. As the election began in earnest, Lysandra and her small delegation made their way across the continent to meet with the dwarves and humans, seeking alliances wherever they could be found. The dragons, meanwhile, launched their own campaign. Britas, though ancient and wary, had the backing of the dragon clans, particularly the younger dragons who had grown restless under the weight of peace. They respected his strength and wisdom but were frustrated by his hesitance to act decisively. In the mountain citadel of Thurin's Peak, where the dwarves had retreated after the war, the tension between the two races reached a boiling point. It was here that Lysandra and Britas would meet face to face for the first time since the war's end. The gathering was meant to be a show of unity, but beneath the surface, old grudges simmered. Lysandra stood in the shadow of the towering dwarven halls, the weight of her mission pressing down on her. She had trained her entire life for this moment, studying diplomacy, strategy, and the history of the great races. She had dreamed of a future where peace was not just a temporary truce but a lasting bond between the races. But as she stood before Britas, She felt the full force of his presence. The Dragon King was an imposing figure, even in his humanoid form. His golden eyes gleamed with a predatory sharpness, and his voice, when he spoke, was deep and resonant. "You speak of peace," he rumbled, his gaze fixed on Lysandra, "yet your people have always been the first to close their doors when the world cries out for aid. What makes you think the elves are ready for such responsibility?" Lysandra met his gaze unflinchingly. "Because we have learned from our mistakes. The war taught us that isolation is no longer an option. If we are to survive, we must do so together." Bratos snorted, a thin trail of smoke escaping his nostrils. "And you believe that you, a reformist, can guide your people through such a transformation?" "I believe that the old ways have failed us," Lysandra replied. "It is time for a new path." Their exchange was brief but charged with tension. Neither leader was willing to back down, and as the election loomed closer, the other races watched with bated breath. Would the ancient Dragon King, with his centuries of wisdom and strength, lead them into the future? Or would the young elf, with her vision of reform and unity, take the reins? As the campaign wore on, Lysandra found herself increasingly drawn to one of Bratos's closest advisors, a young dragon named Eldrin. Unlike the other dragons, who viewed the elves with suspicion or outright disdain, Eldrin was curious about the world beyond his mountain home. He had long questioned the rigid hierarchy of his people and saw in Lysandra's vision a possibility for something new. One evening, after a particularly heated debate between the dragon and elven factions, Lysandra and Eldrin found themselves alone on a balcony overlooking the vast mountain range. The night was cold, the stars shining brightly overhead, and for a moment, the weight of the world seemed to lift. "You're not like the others," Eldrin said, his voice soft, almost contemplative. "You're not just fighting for your people, you're fighting for all of us." Lysandra turned to him, her expression softening. "I have to. If we don't change, we'll destroy ourselves." Eldrin nodded, his golden eyes reflecting the stars above. "I know. I've been thinking the same thing for years. But it's not easy convincing the old guard to let go of the past." They stood in silence for a moment, the tension between them palpable but unspoken. There was something about Eldrin that intrigued Lysandra, a quiet strength, a willingness to question the traditions that had governed his people for so long. And yet, she knew that their growing closeness could complicate everything. "I suppose we're both fighting an uphill battle," she said with a wry smile. Eldrin returned the smile, his sharp features softening. "Seems that way." But as the election approached, it became clear that there were forces at play beyond their control. Whispers of sabotage and betrayal began to circulate, and Lysandra found herself increasingly isolated within her own ranks. The traditionalists among the elves viewed her growing connection with Eldrin as a betrayal, and even her closest allies began to question her loyalties. It wasn't long before things came to a head. A group of Elven dissidents, fearing that Lysandra's progressive policies would weaken their race, launched a covert operation to disrupt the election. Their plan was simple: assassinate Lysandra and frame the dragons for the crime, thereby reigniting the war and ensuring that the old ways would prevail. The attempt came during a formal gathering in the human capital of Valoria, where all the candidates had come together to make their final speeches before the election. Lysandra stood on the grand stage, her voice strong and clear as she outlined her vision for the future. But as she spoke, she felt a sudden, sharp pain in her side. She looked down to see the glint of a dagger protruding from her ribs. The crowd erupted into chaos. Lysandra's guards rushed to her aid, but the damage had been done. She collapsed to the ground, blood seeping from the wound. From the shadows, the assassin slipped away, leaving behind only a trail of confusion and suspicion. As Lysandra lay bleeding, Eldrin rushed to her side. His heart pounded in his chest as he knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he pressed them against the wound, trying to stem the flow of blood. "Stay with me," he whispered urgently, his voice breaking. "We're not done yet." But as the crowd gathered around, Murmurs of blame and accusation began to spread. Many believed the dragons were behind the attack, and tensions soared as old hatreds resurfaced. The fragile peace that had been so carefully maintained now teetered on the edge of collapse. As Lysandra slipped into unconsciousness, Theldrin knew that the real battle had only just begun. Lysandra's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, her body limp in Theldrin's arms. Around them, the commotion grew while guards shouting, diplomats fleeing, and accusations flying through the air like arrows. The blame shifted from one race to the next, with no one fully understanding what had happened. Theldrin didn't care about any of it. His sole focus was on the elf he held, her life slipping through his fingers with every passing second. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, his dragon instincts screaming for vengeance, but he pushed it down. Rage wouldn't save her. "We need a healer," he shouted, his voice commanding the attention of the frantic crowd. Now, two human medics rushed forward, their faces pale with fear. They knelt beside Lysandra, their hands already glowing with the soft, amber light of healing magic. Theldrin held her hand, his gaze never leaving her face, even as the chaos swirled around them. Time seemed to stretch and contract in those moments, but after what felt like an eternity, the bleeding slowed, and Lysandra's breathing steadied. The wound hadn't been fatal barely, but she was far from out of danger. "We've stabilized her, but she needs rest," one of the healers said, his brow slick with sweat. "And time." "A lot of time," Theldrin nodded, barely registering the words. He looked up, meeting the eyes of the other leaders in the room. The humans were huddled together, whispering furiously. The dwarves, ever stoic, stood off to the side, their expressions grim. And the dragons? The dragons were watching him, waiting for a signal, for some indication of what would come next. Britos, the Dragon King, stepped forward, his towering form casting a long shadow over the proceedings. His golden eyes burned with an intensity that made even the most hardened warriors shrink back. He looked down at Lysandra, then at Theldrin, a question in his gaze. "Is she?" Britos asked, his voice low, a rare note of uncertainty in his tone. "She'll live," Theldrin replied, his voice tight. "But barely." Britos nodded, his gaze hardening. "This was no accident. Whoever is behind this seeks to destroy everything we've built." "You think I don't know that?" Theldrin snapped, his anger boiling over for the first time. "But who? The humans? The dwarfs? Our own people? We don't even know where to start." "Start by controlling your emotions," Britos said, his voice cold but calm. "You're too close to this." "Of course, I'm close to this," Theldrin hissed, rising to his feet, his eyes blazing with fury. "She's more than just a candidate. If you think I can stand here and watch them tear her apart, you are a dragon first," Britos interrupted, his voice hard as steel. "Your loyalty is to your people, to the peace we have fought to maintain. Do not let your personal feelings cloud your judgment." Theldrin clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. But he knew Britos was right. The election, the peace, everything hung in the balance now, and he couldn't afford to lose sight of that. But that didn't make it any easier to swallow. As they stood there, locked in a silent battle of wills, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "Enough." It was Lysandra. She had stirred, her voice weak but defiant. The crowd fell silent as all eyes turned to her. Theldrin knelt back down beside her, his heart pounding with relief. Her face was pale, and the pain was etched deeply into her features, but her eyes were clear. "I'm not dead yet," she said, her voice strained but steady. "And I won't be. Not before this is over." "Rest," Theldrin urged, his hand tightening around hers. "You've been through enough." "I don't have time to rest," she replied, shaking her head. "They'll use this. They'll twist it, turn it into something it's not. We can't let them." She tried to sit up, but her strength failed her, and she collapsed back into Theldrin's arms. He held her gently, torn between his desire to protect her and the realization that she was right. Britos watched them both, his expression unreadable. Finally, He spoke. "The election must continue, whoever did this, whatever their motives. We cannot let them derail what we've worked for." Lysandra is right. This is exactly what they want. Theldrin looked up at him, his jaw clenched. "And what do you suggest? We carry on as if nothing happened? Let them get away with it?" "No," Bratos replied, his voice low but fierce. "We find the ones responsible, and we make them pay." The words hung in the air like a promise, cold and deadly. Theldrin nodded slowly, understanding now that there was no turning back. The peace they had fought so hard to build was crumbling, and if they didn't act quickly, it would be lost forever. The days that followed were a blur of tension and suspicion. The investigation into the assassination attempt yielded little, and the fragile alliances between the races began to fray. Accusations flew back and forth, with each faction blaming the other. The humans pointed fingers at the dwarves at the dragons, and the elves found themselves caught in the middle, their trust eroded by the growing paranoia. Despite her weakened state, Lysandra refused to withdraw from the election. She continued her campaign from her bed, speaking to delegates and allies, her voice growing hoarser with each passing day. Theldrin remained by her side, his loyalty unwavering, though he knew every word she spoke only deepened the divide between their people. Bratos, meanwhile, maintained a steady hand over the dragon clans. He commanded respect, but even his influence couldn't quell the growing unrest among the younger dragons, who saw Lysandra's near death as a reason to abandon the election altogether and return to their old ways of dominance through strength. As the final day of voting approached, the tensions boiled over. A mob of angry elves gathered outside the dragon embassy in the human capital, demanding retribution for the attack on Lysandra. They were met with an equally aggressive force of dragons, their tempers flaring as insults turned to threats. Theldrin stood on the steps of the embassy, his heart pounding as he watched the two sides inch closer to violence. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the instinct to fight, to protect his people, but he knew that if they crossed that line, there would be no going back. "Lysandra!" He shouted over the noise, his voice cutting through the din. "We need to do something." She was beside him now, pale and barely able to stand, but her eyes were sharp, her mind clear. She looked out over the crowd, her hand trembling as she gripped the railing for support. "I'm not sure they'll listen," she said, her voice barely audible. "They'll listen to you," Theldrin replied, his gaze locked on hers. "They have to." Taking a deep breath, Lysandra stepped forward. Her voice, though weak, carried through the tension like a beacon. "Enough. This is not who we are. This is not what we fought for." For a moment, the crowd hesitated, caught off guard by the unexpected voice of their leader. But the anger, the fear, the pain that had been festering for so long could not be quelled so easily. A single shout from the crowded traitor, and the mob surged forward. Chaos erupted. The dragons roared, their wings unfurling as they took to the skies, their fire ready to rain down on the elves below. The elves, their bows drawn, prepared to unleash a hail of arrows in return. But before the first blow could be struck, a massive shadow fell over the battlefield. Bratos descended from the sky, his enormous form blocking out the sun as he landed between the two armies. His roar shook the ground, a sound so primal and powerful that it silenced the entire field. "Enough!" he bellowed, his voice carrying with it the weight of centuries of leadership. "You will not do this!" The dragons faltered, their fury tempered by the presence of their king. The elves hesitated, their weapons lowered but not yet discarded. "This is what they want," Bratos continued, his golden eyes sweeping over the crowd. "The ones who tried to kill Lysandra, they want us to tear each other apart. They want war. We will not give it to them." Theldrin stepped forward, his voice steady as he addressed both sides. "We are stronger together. We've always been stronger together. Don't let them take that from us." Slowly, reluctantly, the weapons were lowered, the tension dissipating like mist in the morning sun. The crowd began to disperse, though the distrust lingered in the air like smoke. Lysandra sagged against the railing, Her strength spent. Theldrin caught her before she could fall, holding her close as the weight of the moment pressed down on them both. "We did it," he whispered, though the victory felt hollow. The election was far from over, and the scars of the attack would not heal easily. But for now, there was peace. And that was enough.